Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Matthias Benking. I am a PhD candidate of University of Innsbruck. Today I have an honor of having an interview with the professor Gerhard Mangott. Thank you for this interview. Thank you for agreeing to seeing me today.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, when we speak about Russia, do you have a constant position concerning Russia?
Well, of course, as political scientists, we should not have a predisposition. What sense does it make if someone does have a predisposition towards a country or a culture or a religion? We should be objective analysts trying to find the truth. And that's what we ought to do. But unfortunately, many of my colleagues in the Russia research field do have such a kind of predisposition and have a very biased analysis, and an analysis based very much on moral values and moral attitudes. I think this is wrong. This is not what a scientist should do. And by the way, I also believe journalists should not be activists. They should report objectively as well.
I do believe that it's a mutual problem of both sides. And since we already mentioned this core problem of with no doubt strained relations between Russia and EU, even in the field of science, you could probably elaborate a little bit more on what are probably the origins of these difficulties? Why those two sides don't like each other?
Well, Russia has been part of European politics since Peter I, Piotr I. And Russia has played a very strong role in European politics for the next 300 years. But there's always been some sort of distance, cultural distance between many Western researchers, cultural philosophers, historians, and the Russian counterparts. It does exist this tradition of estrangement between the two sides. But when we come to the political side, we have to say that relations between the European Union and the Russian side have been quite good after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the European Union was convinced that Russia was on its way to democratization, the establishment of the rule of law, and a cooperative foreign policy. However, all that has changed during the era of Vladimir Putin since 2000. And I think Vladimir Putin does no longer see European culture or European civilization or European political systems as a role model for the Russian Federation he thinks of. And of course, the first war Russia, under this premise of a newly aggressive, assertive foreign policy waged in Georgia, actually really changed the perception of most European states of Russia, not at least those of Eastern Europe.
The change that happened between Russia and the West in the 90s, well, to be more precise, in the early 2000s, was it the mutual misunderstanding, or was it the fault of just one side, or was it the Russian policy, or rather European, or both, that split those countries apart?
Actually, it depends on who you ask. If you ask European analysts and politicians, they would argue our hope on the democratization of Russia has not materialized, and that was not our fault because we assisted Russia to the extent possible. When you ask Russian analysts and Russian politicians, they would argue that Europe and NATO have never accepted Russia as an equal partner. They have marginalized Russian interests. Russia had no say in international politics during the 1990s when it was especially weak. And so they argue what we had to do under the Putin era was to respond to this Western neglect of Russia's interests. So you see, there are two clashing narratives we have, and it's not been possible over the past 20 years during the Putin era to find a consensus on a common narrative.
Do you think the EU should continue decreasing the percentage of important resources from Russia and look for alternatives somewhere else, including the Middle East or even United States? Or that is not possible technically at the moment, and it's not the goal that the European Union should go for?
Well, it's not a question of the European Union should do this or that. The fact is that the European Union for more than 10 years has now tried to diversify its import partners, particularly when it comes to gas. because they did not want to accept the strong domination of the Russian Gazprom on the European gas market. However, diversification options are limited. Europe cannot increase gas deliveries from Northern Africa because these countries, Libya, Algeria, are more and more using the gas for their own consumption and cannot actually increase the export volume to Europe. The efforts to get Caspian gas to Europe has been followed very, very strongly. However, Europe has only managed to secure about 10 billion cubic meters of gas from Azerbaijan. Turkmenistan is not interested in selling its gas on the European market. They do it on the Chinese market. So what has been done in the past 12 years, particularly after the gas crisis between Russia and Ukraine, was first to build interconnectors and have reverse flow pipelines. That means getting the capability of transporting gas from Western Europe to Eastern Europe in order to decrease the level of pressure that Russia can exert on Eastern European countries. And the European Union has bought more and more LNG. Well, LNG can be transported worldwide, so you can have LNG from a lot of suppliers. The US administration, particularly in connection with the debate on Nord Stream 2, has offered to sell US LNG to Europe. They can begin by selling up to 40 billion cubic meters of gas to Europe, and they can even increase this volume in the next 10 to 15 years. The question, however, is the LNG gas from the United States competitive on the European gas market? At the moment, it seems that pipeline gas is much more cheaper than LNG. And the second issue for a European Union which wants to preserve the ecological system is whether we should buy fracking gas with all its ecological consequences from the United States instead of pipeline gas from the Russian Federation.
Do you think Norway, probably it's the second partner after Russia to the European Union, could increase the production of the gas and to sell it to European markets with an increased rate?
Not to the extent necessary to cut Russian supplies significantly. What we see at the moment, for instance, is that Poland is going to buy gas from Norway. They are building a pipeline, the Baltic Pipe, together with Denmark. So Norway will in the future supply Poland, and Poland will no longer import gas from Russia starting in 2022. But that's just small numbers. That's not something you can actually use to push Gazprom from the European gas market, or at least weaken its market position.
After the case of poisoning of Alexei Navalny, there have been talks that in Europe, among politicians, that the Nord Stream 2, which is to double the capacity of Nord Stream up to 110 billion cubic meter of natural gas, that this project should be terminated. There's been, after the Crimean occupation in 2014, similar talks among politicians, and after that, for 1 year, there has been no contact between Russia and European Union regarding the prolongation of the project. But in 2015, it's been continued. Do you think both sides are equally interested in this project economically, or there is one player here who will lose or gain more than the other?
Well, you know, for Russia, a stop to the construction of Nord Stream 2 would be bad news, of course. They would have sunk costs. Gazprom would have sunk costs of about 5 billion. European companies, however, would also have sunk costs of about 5 billion. But it's not that much. Gazprom can afford. And Russia does have not a financial problem with a stop to Nord Stream 2, but a geopolitical one, because the alternative that remains for Russia to bring its gas to Europe is the pipeline transit network of Ukraine. And this, of course, gives Ukraine a lot of leverage over Russia, because they simply can confront Gazprom with high transit fees, and Gazprom has to agree, because if it doesn't, Ukraine would not transport the gas via its pipelines. So geopolitically, a cancellation of Nord Stream 2 would be very bad for the Russian side. For the European side, particularly for Germany, of course it would be bad as well, because Nord Stream 2 would have guaranteed a safe and secure supply of gas to Germany and to other European countries, because Germany would have delivered the gas to Western Europe and to Central Europe. So Germany will lose this position as a major gas hub it could have had with the finishing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And German companies like Uniper or BASF Wintershall will lose a lot of money. And if the Germans now, even if they call it a European decision, cancel all the contracts in order to stop the project, they will have to pay lots of money to the Russians, to the European companies, because there are more than 100 European companies involved in the construction of Nord Stream 2 from 12 EU countries. So they will all ask for getting the money back from the European Union and all Germany.
It's also been quite clear from your previous statements that the geopolitics regarding the Nord Stream 2 are of a more importance than the poisoning itself, the moral side of the poisoning. That it shouldn't be, that should be investigated, that there should be a certain punishment on individuals or on the state if it was committed by the federal authorities of Russia. So could you explain why the geopolitical part in this case is more crucial?
But there have been moral judgments about Russian politics, about Vladimir Putin personally over the past 20 years by many Western politicians from Europe and the United States. And rightly so. There was so much to criticize about the conduct of politics in Russia in the Putin era. But until 2014, the European Union has not imposed sanctions on Russia, let alone financial and economic sanctions or restrictive measures, as the European Union likes to call it. So the first real substantial negation of Russian politics was done in 2014 by the European Union with these restrictive measures. But the pipeline project Nord Stream 2 was agreed upon in 2015, even after the Ukraine crisis had started. And it was actually characterized by Germany's government as a business-to-business cooperation with no political institutions or political leaders involved. And so Angela Merkel, as the head of the CDU-CSU, the main governing party in Germany, and as the Chancellor of Germany, has always insisted, while we have differences in on political issues and topics, this should be separated from the business-to-business contacts in the case of Nord Stream 2. What the Navalny poisoning has changed is that Merkel now no longer rules out that such occurrences as this attempted murder also need to have implications for the business-to-business contacts. And that is a new quality that we see here. Merkel is still quite cautious about it, but she does no longer rule out that the pipeline construction will be suspended or even cancelled because of the poisoning.
Since you already mentioned the hard punishment from Germany, from the European Union, it is wide known, especially among Russian experts, that Russia has been eluding those sanctions that were imposed years ago, since the Crimea situation. On the contrary, every new package of sanctions causes another wave of criticism in this informational war. And moreover, the Russian government agreed to cover losses of sanctioned by Western states companies from the finances of the national budget. So basically, it's the taxpayers who are paying for the sanctions imposed by the Western states. Do you think there is an alternative solution for a certain type of a punishment that will strike directly the Russian establishment, directly the oligarchs and top ranks, but not the ordinary people, not the taxpayers?
Well, so far the European Union has imposed only so-called smart sanctions on Russia after the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. In contrast to comprehensive sanctions the United States had imposed on Iraq in the 1990s, when the Iraqi population suffered a lot from these sanctions, the European Union wants to use so-called smart sanctions targeting top-level politicians and individuals and state companies without a very tough effect on the general situation of the Russian population. So what we have seen so far are diplomatic sanctions, expelling Russian diplomats for that matter, as we had in the case of Sergei Skripal, gas poisoning attempt in March 2018. We will have again these diplomatic sanctions and see Russian diplomats expelled. We will have more of the blacklisting that the European Union had started already in 2014. That means more Russian politicians, individuals and companies, particularly state companies, will be sanctioned under these blacklisting sanctions, meaning that their assets in the European Union will be frozen and that the individuals can no longer travel to the European Union. I don't see that the European Union would impose harsher financial and economic sanctions on Russia. I don't think that there's a consensus within the European Union to go that far. So they will still primarily rely on diplomatic sanctions and blacklisting. So the Russian population will not be affected particularly hardly by these sanctions. Yes, a bit, but not very strong. But then on the other hand, you have to realize that if the sanctions are not tough enough, as they aren't at the moment, the likelihood that the Russian government will change its behavior on issues of vital national interest is very, very low.
And what do you think are the chances that relations between Russia and European Union will improve while President Putin is holding his post?
Well, most European politicians have a very negative view about Vladimir Putin and don't think that détente between Russia and Europe or even some sort of cooperation will not work until Vladimir Putin is in power, because they think that under Putin Russia is not interested in cooperation with the European Union. So there's a strong negative view. However, we have seen even after the Ukraine crisis in 2014 and the poisoning of Skripal in the spring of 2018, that France, the French President Emmanuel Macron, has tried to regain contacts, diplomatic channels, working groups with the Russian side. He started a policy of rapprochement and was heavily criticized for this in Eastern Europe, but also by some Western European countries. So we see that even after very strong events like the annexation of Crimea or the military destabilization of eastern Ukraine, there will be powers who, despite Putin being in power, try to get closer contacts with Moscow. However, after the Navalny poisoning and the meddling of Russia in the Belarusian affairs, I don't think that for the next years, 4 to 5 years, we will see any sort of new initiative like the one we've seen by France in 2019.
Belarus and Russia speaking about some sort of an integration between those two countries. And previously, even after the elections, the full integration of Belarus into Russia was rejected by both sides. But don't you think now there are higher chances for it to end up as fact? Or we are talking about some other sort of integration between those two states?
But you know, it's a Russian vital interest that Belarus is an ally and remains an ally for military reasons, for economic reasons, for political reasons. So the Russians are trying hard to retain Belarus as an ally. They don't have to fear the opposition, which currently is not anti-Russian, but it could develop into an anti-Russian direction. But they are now taking a policy that to keep Lukashenko in power, at least for the time being, because Lukashenko is now in a very weak position towards Russia. Lukashenko is completely dependent on Russia for his survival as the president of Belarus. So he will make all the concessions Moscow wants to get from the Belarusian leader. But I think in a mid-term perspective, the Russians are interested to substitute Lukashenko for another Belarusian politician who is ready and willing to be loyal to Moscow. For the European side, it's quite difficult to influence the situation in Belarus. Trade between Belarus and the European Union is not very strong. Only about 18% of Belarusian trade turnover with the European Union, and inflicting financial and economic sanctions on Belarus would certainly have an effect on the population. Diplomatic sanctions, well, you can do that, but it will not have an impact on how Lukashenko will behave. Then there is the blacklisting, and that is what the European Union is trying to do. Put together a list of individuals and companies that they would keep out of the European financial market and impose travel bans on politicians. The European Union is trying to do so already for 4 weeks now. It takes a lot of time, because if you sanction a person, the person, of course, can go to court over this decision. So the European Commission must have strong evidence that a Belarusian politician is implicated in the repression of Lukashenko against the opposition. But it's most likely that at the end of this month, we will see that the foreign ministers of the European Union will agree on these blacklisting sanctions. But it's not sure yet, because the government of Cyprus is threatening to block the sanctions on Belarus unless the European Union also inflicts heavier sanctions on Turkey. They have this linkage because Cyprus and Greece are in a strong, almost even military conflict with Turkey over the borders in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. So it could be that Cyprus will simply block these blacklisting sanctions, and that of course would be a real blow to the image of the European Union as an active foreign policy actor. We have to wait and see. There will be strong pressure on Cyprus to agree. But then again, even if these blacklisting sanctions will be imposed, I don't think that they will have any impact on how Lukashenko behaves.
Professor, thank you very much for your time and for your answers. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.